All right, it is 6:01, so I'd love to get started if we could. So I would like to say that I am Sharon Reed, and I'm the Programs and Events Coordinator for the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our virtual panel discussion. Tonight is Centering Indigenous Knowledges in a Nebulous Movement. Today's program will run for approximately an hour, and we'll have time for questions near the end of the conversation. We do encourage you, don't wait till the very end to enter your question into the chat function or the Q&A, but you can enter at any time during the program. We are recording, and we will make this program available on the Hood Museum of Art's YouTube channel, the link for which we will send out in a follow-up email tomorrow. Just a couple of housekeeping tips. If your device allows, you can enhance your viewing experience of this program by clicking on the viewing options next to the green bar that notes that the speaker is sharing their screen. If you just scroll down to the side-by-side option, you'll be able to view both the presentation and the speakers without overlap. And you can also zoom in on the presentation through view options as well by adjusting your zoom ratio. If you're joining us on an iPad, you can zoom in and out by simply pinching your fingers on the screen. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague, Jami Powell, Associate Curator of Native American Art. Jami?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you to Sharon, my incredible colleague who has done all of the behind-the-scenes work to make this evening possible. As Sharon mentioned, my name is Jami Powell, and I am the Associate Curator of Native American Art here at the Hood Museum, as well as a lecturer in the Native American Studies Department. I would like to begin our program this evening with acknowledging the Hood Museum of Art and Dartmouth is situated upon the ancestral and unceded lands of the Abenaki peoples. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, the continued existence of Indigenous peoples, and the museum and Dartmouth's commitment to building respectful relationships with those who call these lands home today. I would also like to take a moment to thank everyone who is here this evening for joining us during this ongoing and challenging time. Our thoughts go out to all who have suffered with the coronavirus or experienced the loss of family, friends, or colleagues. We wish you all healing and good health. This conversation has been a long time in the making and is part of the programming for Form and Relation Contemporary Native Ceramics, which is currently on view at the Hood Museum of Art. I co-curated this exhibition alongside Morgan E. Freeman, the former Domley Native American Art Fellow, and the show was scheduled to be on view from March through August. However, as we were finishing the installation of the exhibition, our world changed in ways that most of us could not have even imagined. Although the museum is still closed to the public, and it seems strange to talk about this project with you when we can't see the incredible work in person, it has become clear that we need to grapple with the awkwardness and complexity of our current moment, not just in relation to the global pandemic, but also in terms of the myriad entanglements and impositions that impact our lives and our futures. The guiding questions for Form and Relation, which are posed in the catalog, as well as the introductory text in the galleries, ask, how can we shift our understanding of the land from one of ownership and extraction to one of relationality? How do we move toward a recognition of our shared humanity? And how do we create a world in which future generations can thrive? Looking at these questions now, they seem to resonate even more deeply than they did when Morgan and I wrote the text over a year ago. This brings us to our conversation for this evening. Using these questions, as well as Courtney M. Leonard's installation, Breach Logbook 20 Nebulous, within the exhibition, we wanted to take an opportunity to dig deep and engage in a different kind of dialogue, and very likely one that raises questions instead of provides answers. Instead of asking each of the speakers to present their work before entering into dialogue, we're going to dive right in. In order to facilitate this format, images from the speakers will cycle through multiple times and come back around. If anyone wants to reference a specific image, You all get the pleasure of watching me struggle with the PowerPoint to find that particular image. Before I ask the first question, I want to introduce you to each of our speakers. Suzanne Greenlaw is a citizen of the Halton Band of Maliseet Indians and is a Ph.D. candidate in the School of Forest Resources at the University of Maine. Greenlaw's academic research examines the friction area between Indigenous and Western scientific knowledge to address issues of Indigenous access restriction to culturally significant plants such as sweetgrass and brown ash trees. This interdisciplinary and participatory-based research focuses on Wabanaki stewardship approaches and cultural protocols to assert Indigenous sovereignty and traditional ecological knowledge within natural resource management. Greenlaw's ongoing research with Acadia National Park and Wabanaki Nations aims to provide a framework for culturally appropriate engagement between Native American gatherers and national parks. Courtney M. Leonard is a citizen of the Shinnecock Nation and is an artist and filmmaker whose work explores the intersections and interconnections of marine biology, Indigenous food sovereignty, migration, and human environmental impact. Leonard's current projects articulate the multiple definitions of the term breach and investigate and document Indigenous communities' historical ties to water, marine life, and subsistence. Leonard's practice centers narratives of cultural viability and the relationship between Indigenous people in the environmental record. Leonard has been the recipient of numerous awards, fellowships, and residencies that include the Andy Warhol Foundation, the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, the Rasmussen Foundation, the United States Art and Embassies Program, and the Native Arts and Culture Foundation. Leonard's work is in the permanent collections of the Heard Museum, the Peabody Essex Museum, the Newark Museum, the Denver Art Museum, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, among numerous others. I am also proud to say that a significant body of her work in the form of Breach Logbook 20 Nebulous is now in the permanent collection of the Hood Museum of Art as well. Dr. Nick Rio is a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians and is an associate professor of Native American and environmental studies at Dartmouth College. Professor Rio's research examines Indigenous knowledge and ecological stewardship on Indigenous lands. He is particularly interested in the ways traditional ecological knowledge, ecosystem stewardship, and socio-ecological adaptation contribute to sustainability in the context of rapid environmental change. His recent work studies tribal participation in polycentric environmental governance and on large-scale Indigenous-led stewardship of riparian ecosystems. And for those of you who don't know what riparian means, I Googled it for all of us earlier today, and riparian areas are the transition zones between aquatic or water-based systems and terrestrial or land-based systems, and usually have characteristics of both. So thank you each for being here. I'm really grateful to participate and just witness this conversation. So Courtney, I'd like to pose the first question to you. And to be honest, this is a real cop-out on my part as the moderator, because I'm going to ask you your own question. Breach Logbook 20 Nebulous is a single iteration of your ongoing project, Breach, an annual logbook and visual account of the environmental degradation, fragility, and crises impacting coastal Indigenous communities. The overarching question you pose through this project is, can a culture sustain itself when it no longer has access to the environment that fashions that culture? Can you talk about how you came to this question and how Nebulous wrestles with this question?
Yes, Tabutni, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Suzanne and Nick and everyone for your support and being here and sharing. I believe I came to Breach specifically and in regard to that question in terms of witnessing the impact that our community is facing on the east end of Long Island in specifically to coastal erosion and rising waters, and then also to the degradation of our water quality over time, how it's affecting our shellfish and ability to feed ourselves locally, And then through that acknowledgement and witnessing, also looking at, in 2004, a 50-ton, 40-foot finback whale had washed ashore on, there's Shinnecock Bay, there's Dune Road, and then there's the Atlantic Ocean. And Shinnecock, our reservation, is our traditional lands. We weren't relocated, but the Hamptons border our reservation. And at the time that the whale was struck and its carcass had washed ashore, it was on the Dune Road side, which is where all the mansions are. So my bay neighbor used to be the DuPont property, and then it was purchased by a man who knighted himself, and then it was purchased by Calvin Klein as a I'm not sure how many numbers of homes he has, but not his first. And in that regard, the last thing that the community of the Hamptons wanted was a rotting whale to disturb their summer in the Hamptons. And so that whale at that time was removed from the location without necessarily having our community involved in ceremony or the ability to properly be with the whale, and then also have access to the essence of the whale, either through bones, baleen, oil, which traditionally we would do. So this notion of imposition, this notion of authority and responsibility led me into the question, can a culture sustain itself when it no longer has access to the environment that fashions it? And I do believe that a culture can, but it doesn't need to be as difficult as it is through the imposition, through the lack of acknowledgement or involvement with our communities within these spaces and decision making. Was there a portion of that question I missed? Was I supposed to say how it led into Nebulous? Each year I do a different breach logbook or visual account of what I'm looking at. And I was honored with the opportunity to meet you, to think through form and relation in relationship to place. And so a part of this work is connecting with community and having the ability to travel up there and witness what's happening close to Dartmouth in relationship to breach as a whole. And while I was there, I went to the Wilder Dam. There were a few locations, but the Wilder Dam was one of them. And I was just thinking about what is this connection between Indigenous spaces where the Connecticut River does flow out into the Sound, into Long Island. There is kind of our bloodline of water and relation with one another, whether we are in different territories, and having this bridging of conversations, I'm hoping can help expand the issues, because sometimes people don't listen to small coastal Indigenous communities or small Indigenous communities within these narratives and experiences. And with knowing that in my history, then that's kind of where breach needs to be whole. It needs to be involved in cross-linked engagement, and it needs to have a more human world response. And so looking at the Wilder Dam and looking at Lyman Point Park specifically, our responsibility and ties to what goes into the water, what comes off the land, how the runoff is engaging, is what led me into the forms that are installed within Nebulous. And the idea of Nebulous came from witnessing a ghost trap that was left behind on the east end of Montauk, and thinking about this engagement as the whales migrate up the East Coast to feed and to calve and to have relation. And just how do we bridge that connection of imposition? So the dam being this imposition, the artifice and the detritus of what man leaves behind as being the imposition, and then ultimately our responsibility to one another and with one another.
Yeah, so I'm hearing a few words that you're using that I think resonate with the work that Nick and Suzanne do. And this is thinking about relationships and responsibility. And so I don't know if either of you want to kind of talk about, the way that, relationships and responsibility or accountability factor into the work that you do.
Sure. I can go first, or Nick, do you want to go first? Okay. So the work I do, it really centers Indigenous people first, and or as the focus. And so that's always with gatherers or harvesters are a part of every aspect. And, as well as I'm a harvester. And so you just understand an Indigenous protocol and perspective in this type of work, right? Like, so relationality is a aspect of our culture where we see our relationships, or we see ourselves in relationships to the natural world, and that is always an aspect of when a harvester is out in that landscape, through how they steward the landscape, through the practice of visiting a site year after year. And so it becomes, those trees or the grass is a relative, in the sense that you see it grow all the time. You share energy with that space. And then as you harvest it, you also are sharing energy, and there's a reciprocal relationship that grows in the practice of harvesting. Oftentimes we end up, like, it's a stewardship practice, or where the landscape or the ecosystem benefits from us being there, instead of more of an extractive nature, where you're not even aware of that ecosystem, or how does those relatives respond to us being there. So we're always sort of aware of our engagement with the natural world, and what we leave behind, and also we believe that the natural world holds, or these landscapes hold, our ancestors, right? That when we're there, we're also there harvesting with our ancestors beside us, guiding us. So really, that's the centered Indigenous perspective that is a part of our research, or my research, where that is always upheld and respected and understood.
So I could add a little bit. I think that the things that Courtney and Suzanne just shared definitely resonate for me, first of all. But in the work that I do, and also just kind of in terms of like life practice, I think that I spend a lot of time thinking about people's connections to place, and that has everything to do with individuals and communities' relationships to those places. And what the relationship is based upon is essentially sort of an exchange of gifts, that we all have different things that we're able to offer. Humans have things that they're able to offer as gifts to their our neighbors and our relations, and all the different plants and animals in our environments have gifts that they offer, and there's an exchange that happens, and that comes with responsibility. So accepting those gifts comes with responsibility. Being in relationship with a place, or being in relationship with whales for Courtney, or maybe other like different fish, like whitefish where I'm from, or walleye. Being in a relationship with those beings it's all about responsibility. So it's not can't be focused on what you can always get out of it. There needs to be an exchange, and that's that responsibility. So it's looking out for one another. So we have our and all the peoples that I've had a chance to work with over the years, and then within my own community, and Anishinaabe culture, folks recognize that there's the responsibilities involve creating space for those other relations, those more than human relations, helping to make their worlds healthier, making sure that they have space to thrive. And so those are the forms of sort of relationship and responsibility, and those linkages that I'm most interested in and focused on.
Yeah, I'm always struck by the kind of intergenerational and interpersonal generosity, both of artists that I work with, but also Indigenous academics and communities who I, have had the benefit of working with and learning from. A lot of the work that each of you engages in is really thinking about kind of building bridges or facilitating communication between communities or ways of knowing, epistemologies that don't often have many points of intersection. Can you talk about some of the challenges of trying to kind of find places to create those bridges? Or I think, Suzanne, you've referred to this as, like the points of friction that come up within your work and how you've addressed some of those challenges.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of points of friction when you weave or try to combine an Indigenous perspective and Indigenous people in sort of a Western science tradition, right? Like of studies or engagement with natural resource managers. There's a lot of points, but I'll think of a couple right now. Is one is time and money. Usually, like to truly engage with Native people, it requires a lot of relationship building, and that requires money that often studies do not support, or engagement doesn't really support that sort of time and money. In our studies, we really work at making sure we have money to pay all of the harvesters that are participating in the project. That we don't assume that they can volunteer their time, because everybody else is getting paid. Why shouldn't they be getting paid too? It's about respect, I think, as well. Respecting their knowledge as an expert knowledge, and I think it's a first step of showing respect to them in that relationship building. Other points of frictions are that sort of maybe communication engagement between maybe an educated natural resource professional and a harvester or a traditional knowledge holder, right? Oftentimes I think in Western science, we're taught that we're the experts all the time, that we know the most. Like even myself, like I get told that I'm an expert in brown ash when I've been studying it, 5 years, and there's people who have been harvesting for 50 years. That ego of the scientist oftentimes shuts down Indigenous people. It's a big point of friction, and it's really hard to sort of engage some natural resource professionals who can't see those that colonial legacy kind of framework that they've been taught, right? It's because oftentimes the way they built their career up is on these certain practices, and to show them a different way can be a challenge. But I'm sure other people have points of friction they could talk about as well. I'll pass on the baton.
In one of the slides, well, this one in particular, I would probably say my initial point of friction growing up is the notion of erasure, the lack of inclusion of our voices in writing as a primary source versus a secondary or third. And so this particular image is from a newspaper article in reference to the Circassian, which was a tall ship, a cargo ship that was barged in the sand and the turn of the century, and our men were forced by gunpoint to go and unload the cargo. And at one point, as the hurricane was coming in and bad weather was coming in, our women had gone to the shore to see if their men was able to come off the ship, and they started singing to one another. And when they no longer heard their voices and no longer heard the songs and the fires that they had kept on the ship to burn to keep warm had gone out, then they knew that they had passed away and froze. And then eventually the next day on horse and buggy, they walked the shore to gather the men to bring them home to be buried. In that regard, there were men from our community who passed away, but it was written in the books as if all the Shinnecock seeds had died, and that therefore we had died as a community. And I think in that regard, when you're reading about the idea of you not existing as a teenager within these texts, knowing who you are and where you come from, and knowing, you know, that is a falsehood, then that notion of authority might have kind of come into question when I was a youth, to a certain degree, in terms of the work that I do with Breach, is how can I counter that and lift our voices in acknowledgement of our presence and our resiliency. And I would say that in that regard, I'm not going to say a false truth in the fact that this isn't a hard process, and in terms of sciences, in terms of Indigenous knowledge, working within these systems. But I will say that I'm also fortunate as an artist to have been supported in the way that I can move through spaces, because I don't necessarily allow people to have me think in a linear fashion. So I'll move through materials, I'll move through ways of seeing. I work with anthropologists, I work with marine biologists, ecologists, lots of communities, and I just keep going with my gut, which is what I really appreciate about Breach, that has afforded me the opportunity to travel all over the world, reconnecting with places that our men had sailed on the tall ships during the Yankee whaling industry. So there have been moments, I mean, being a female, I'm a mother, there's a lot of sometimes friction if I allow other people to assume what my capabilities are. And holding that space, I think, and also something that you offered at one point, Jami, that I still hold on to, is the notion of protecting your joy. And I think that that's something that I have to be mindful of, because this work can be intense. And I have to go back to notions of the joy, like, you know, why am I doing this? And should I be giving so much weight to things that are hard to deal with sometimes? So I really have been enjoying seeing your images, Nick and Susan, because they include the people, and they include the joy, and they include the coming together, which is the part of who we are. And that's something that I'm hesitant to put in the images, but that's what Breach is. It's not mine, and I don't sign the work. That's something about Breach, is that what I've learned is this coming together, and the knowledge that's a part of Breach, this record, is a gift from my family in Aotearoa, in Utqiagvik, in Mi'kmaq territory up in Nova Scotia, Shinnecock. It's everybody. So yeah.
So the this idea of being challenging sometimes to kind of come together and work together, and when you posed your question, what I was picturing is how it can be challenging to get Indigenous nations, Indigenous organizations and actors to work in, you know, collaboratively together with their non-Indigenous neighbors on environmental issues, on issues of land care, coastal zone stewardship, things like that. That's what I was picturing in your question. And I think that there's a whole long kind of list of challenges that occur, but a kind of a typical thing, and I'll kind of rattle through. This will be sort of like four things that happen maybe, or something like that, but it could oftentimes all happens in like individual examples. But, you know, so first of all, a lot of times you find non-Indigenous organizations, whether they be federal agencies, state agencies, NGOs, what have you, trying to bring tribes or First Nations or other Indigenous partners into an initiative or a project, sort of as late as an afterthought almost. So like inviting us in because it seems strategic, or it maybe even seems like the right thing to do, but the idea is pretty fully formed. And so then it's inviting this partner to kind of jump into something that's already been sort of established. And it's, you know, it never feels good to be an afterthought. And also, you know, Indigenous partners want to, they want to be involved in the creation of the structures, the decision-making structures, the priorities, and all of that. And so you kind of need to be there from the beginning for that to happen. The other thing that I see happen is non-Indigenous, you know, maybe even would-be allies, making an assumption that we're all kind of in the same circumstances. You know, like let's say you're neighbors with a group, and you share a coastline or something, or you share a commitment to a body of water. If there's like a threat to that environment, it's not the same for everybody involved. And so we're not all in the same boat. We might all care about that. We may have something in common in caring for that place, but the context is different. The histories are different. The politics are different. The priorities are different. And so it can be an obstacle to collaborating if one group is assuming that everybody's on the same page when they're not. You know, and then yeah, I think that those are some of the bigger things. I think one of the things that needs to happen in general, in terms of kind of creating more, I guess, more space for Indigenous groups to participate in the work that's happening. You know, if you're, let's say, a director of an NGO that wants to partner with tribes and hasn't had much success in that arena, one thing to just consider is that there's oftentimes a need, I would say almost always a need, for, you know, more than just bringing in a partner to meet you where you're at. Oftentimes you need to be able to flex, to change your plans, your priorities somewhat. And I guess what it really boils down to is sharing power. So if you've got groups that kind of have most of the power, they have most of the money, they have most of the access to land, they have most of the access to decision makers, that sort of thing. You kind of need to share some of that power. You need to be able to sort of create space and share power with Indigenous partners if you want these relationships to come together. And that's a hard thing to do. I mean, most people don't want to give up money, give up land, give up access to decision makers, give up real seats at the table for making decisions, things like that. And that's oftentimes what's needed.
Yeah, I've talked about this, especially in terms of museum work, as a willingness to cede authority and to cede space. And I know, you know, it was interesting to work on this project with Courtney, and we had the benefit of, you know, bringing her to campus a couple of times to do research for the project and to do some filming. And then, you know, as the process went along, my colleagues were more and more wanting to know, okay, so what exactly is this going to look like? And, you know, from Courtney's perspective, it was kind of like, well, I'll know once we're in the space and we start doing the installation. I don't know exactly, but it's going to work. And so, you know, I trusted Courtney, and I think my colleagues trusted or wanted to trust us. And fortunately, they kind of took the leap, and it turned out to be spectacular. So I don't know, Courtney, can you talk a little bit? We've gotten a question about kind of some of the forms in your installation. I'll go back to some of those slides to, if you want to guide me to, you know, okay. I guess I can go back to the first.
So I think one of the things that I should acknowledge as a part of my process that does come a bit from like song and community is the notion of like call and response. And so some communities have dances like stomp dances where someone is calling and the community is responding. And I do feel that the work of Breach is a call and response, that to clarify within art, I've hubbed under logbooks so that people who are not familiar with an artist that is responding in new ways can understand the consistency of the work. And so when I do the installations and the research, I can't determine the preset of what that's going to look like if I'm truly going to be responding to the place and what I'm learning along the journey. And that becomes not necessarily the norm for people who are used to seeing the same thing shown over and over again, or like the same installation or environment that they may have seen elsewhere, traveling to another location and understanding where A is going to go and B is going to go and C is going to go. And so the question is in relationship to some of the titles that I give pieces, which I don't really like to title. So they're actually a codex. So when whales are struck, the North Atlantic Oceanic Committee, International Whaling Committee, there's an accession report that's given and a number given to the whale. So any components, baleen, bones, they go with that number. So it's like a registration number. So when I think about the language of the forms, I'm looking at that extension of a code that's being logged. And so flow trap, the specific kind of trapezoid of some of the forms that were developed specifically for nebulous, is countering the word flow, which is looking at the geometric components of the Wilder Dam. The way that it has those angles was really interesting to me. The way that one railing casts the shadow and light is an extension of form in the work. And it also lends to the layers in the ocean that is referred to as the euphotic zone, which is where light comes through and you're supposed to have like healthier growth. And then the word trap isn't necessarily our word in terms of philosophy and completely trapping a species from being able to either lend itself into that space or go past that space. So the flow trap, or I think I have like LG one, or there's certain codes for color or certain codes for the language, but they're pretty universal and extended. And when I first started weaving these forms, this is all earthenware, coiled and woven. It's not wire work. When I started making them, it was in a response to a mass fish die in 2015 off of Riverhead with a lot of Mehedan that were kind of herded into more closed areas than the ocean, and then they eventually lost oxygen and died. And I thought about this notion of fragility in the environment that I was witnessing, and then weaving this fish basket that couldn't function also. It wouldn't be able to gather fish and it wouldn't be able to function. And then throughout the years, the response is kind of leading a new weave or leading a new layer. So I appreciate the patience and the trust, but I wonder if that is like an Indigenous concept. I don't know, but I appreciate the humanness of people believing in me and offering the space and the time and the relation. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes as museum professionals and academics, we really want to have things polished and clean, and we have copy editors look at our work multiple times before we put it out into the world. Whereas, and I talked earlier about kind of the intellectual generosity of artists, is that you all are putting work out into the world in process, putting out studies, raising ideas and solutions for some of these problems that, the rest of us in academia and museums are kind of sitting around talking about. Sometimes I feel like you're the ones actually doing the work. So I really appreciate the, kind of the way that you also hold your ground too, in terms of your practice and the way that you want to go about doing this work and the deep research that goes into it. And even, today with this panel and this conversation we're having, you were adamant that it not necessarily be all about your installation, but that you use the installation as an opening to this conversation. And I think that's, you know, a really different approach from how, you know, museums expect artists to talk about their work and engage with an installation that's on view. I want to ask a question, you know, in thinking about these forms and how they're woven. And, you know, for those of you in the audience who didn't hear, that there's no wire in these forms at all, that these are all woven ceramic works. And the skill that that takes is incredible. But Suzanne, you also are a weaver. Although I think you said that you don't like to call yourself an artist yet, but you are an emerging weaver, a practicing fledgling weaver. And so could you talk a little bit about like the process of weaving and working with your hands and how, you know, that work has impacted your research on that same material?
Sure. I call myself like a 20-year apprentice, really. Only because I've been really fortunate that I started weaving before I did the research, but it was the project was offered to me to work with my community. And so working with weavers and research helped me to develop those relationships even more so. And so I will steal some from my husband. My husband's a weaver. He's a basket maker. And he talks a lot about sort of like the art of basket making, especially with brown ash basket making, that that you go to the forest that you've been visiting year after year, and that an elder has shown you year after year, and you cut down a tree that you've seen sitting there for a long time, and the art of processing that material from where you pound the log inch after inch, and then you really kind of you take the wood apart as it grew. So you're not using a machine or anything, right? These are all hand tools. Native art generally is with hand tools, and those hand tools generally are actually handmade with a lot of native art. And so you're just, the integrity of the material is still maintained through using your hands, and the energy of that tree is still maintained as well. And so you're just reshaping a tree into a container where the material is all the same. It hasn't been broken apart in ways that it didn't grow that way, right? You're breaking apart from this by the growth rings when you're making baskets for brown ash. And so there's an exchange of energy as well with your materials in your hands. And oftentimes you have an intended idea for that basket, but sometimes the way the wood grew, it will change what your intention is. So you have to respond to the way the wood wants to be used as well. And then also in that weaving, you have your teachers there, I guess, in the sense that who taught you, you use those same practices. And oftentimes when you look at baskets, you can see, it kind of tells you a story of the basket maker will tell you a story by how they chose to do things. And you can see that in certain techniques and things like that. And so, and also you can see people's art, like the generations of the teachings and how the art is transformed and moved to be in their own style, but yet you can see still the background behind them. And then how that informs my research in the way that I think just the values and importance of finding tools to help with brown ash, right? We have emerald ash borer here, and it's going to decimate our ash population. And we want tools to respond. We just don't want to be victims. We want to be able to do something and try different things. And we're the last state to get it. So we're hoping that maybe with all of this knowledge, from the past 10 years, we can be successful in retaining some seed sources, and things like that. So regeneration can happen if brown ash does get decimated. But our value system around this tree in this basket is quite large in the sense that it also helped us to resist assimilation policies. It's a source of income for people with a high poverty rate. It maintains our culture, our value systems, our relationships, all in this art form. I'm not sure if that answered. I think that kind of answered, but it was kind of convoluted, maybe how I responded.
Well, and I think that's how all of this works, is that all of these issues that we're talking about are deeply complicated and entangled in colonial processes. And, you know, within Western structures, we like to try and like put things into neat boxes, and, you know, break things down into digestible pieces. And that's not how any of this work or research that you all are doing, it simply can't be done. And so I'm wondering, Nick, can you talk a little bit about how you kind of teach these, like this idea of complexity within your classes or through your work, and, you know, how you sometimes maybe help the public understand how to grapple with this complexity? Or me, how do I grapple with the complexity?
Well, I mean, one thing that that we talk about in some of my classes, and that I that I think a little bit about sometimes, is that that Indigenous knowledge is one of the kind of unique characteristics of Indigenous knowledge systems, is that they in Indigenous knowledge holders, is that they're able to take really complex concepts and issues and sort of do some like synthesis work and describe them, or describe potential ways of addressing issues, or describe complex ideas in less complex ways than maybe counterparts. And so one way I've heard it described, like in the literature, is through a comparison to you know, there's areas of like mathematics that is like that kind of maps onto that a little bit. I think it's like fuzzy logic or fuzzy theory. Does anybody have background? I'm trying to remember. I think it's called fuzzy logic, but it's basically, you get this really complex web of relationships and interactions and causes and effects and things. But there's techniques in mathematics for sort of boiling it down to like just sort of core constituent relationships, and like really trying to sort of simplify complexity. And I think that's a thing that Indigenous knowledge holders that I've been able to interact with are able to do well. It's not that they understand the issues in simply, it's that they're able to take all that complexity and understand it, and then communicate it and articulate it in more basic and understandable terms. And so, I mean, that's something that I you know, that you can see in things like, as an example would be the Indigenous practice that you see across a lot of different cultures of recognizing linkages in nature in the way that things are timed. So knowing that a particular activity is linked to another phenomenon, and so like paying attention to the development of, say, flowers on particular species of tree. And when you see them go into flower, then you know that certain things are happening with a fishery. You know, the seemingly disconnected, disparate things, but they're part of a complex system. And through, you know, thousands of years of observation, folks pick up that this timing is pretty consistent. And so that's an example of taking something that's really complex, and there's actually maybe a connection there. It may not be just coincidental, but even if it is coincidental, just being able to kind of say, you know, we're gonna, before we harvest, you know, this particular fish, we're gonna make sure that this is happening with the deer population or with this particular species of tree. Things like that, I think are important to pay attention to and to think about.
Yeah, and I think, you know, a lot of the ways that you know, this knowledge is understood within communities is based within language, and you know, it's really difficult to translate some of these concepts into English, or to talk about some of these things using English words, because those English terms, carry a lot of baggage, and, understanding informed by Western structures. I think about words like, sacred or ceremony. And within some communities, ceremony is really about knowledge transfer. But because of all the kind of, thanks to my people, the anthropologists, not my Osage people, but that, ceremony is, there's automatically assumptions that come with using that kind of word, or, even thinking about the word traditional and kind of the traditional ecological knowledge framework that you're working within, that, there's baggage associated with that. And so it can be difficult to, convey that, just because of the limitations of the language. So we've got a few minutes, and we've had some questions come in. If folks have questions from that they'd like to pose, feel free to put it into the chat or the Q&A. One of the questions we received is someone who's wondering how relationality with land relates to resiliency within communities.
Well, it's good to have land. I think that was the initial thing I thought of was, the notion and the history, and we don't have enough time, but if you aren't familiar with what reservations or allotments are, please look into that history and how that is. How do we deal with that in terms of rising waters? And how do we deal with that in terms of possibilities of being able to transition as a people if we no longer have the land? So the notion of coming home is really beautiful. I miss home with the current situation that we're in with the pandemic and not knowing certain things. I haven't been home for a while now, and that's not something. I'm currently living in Minnesota, Dakota Territory, and I try not to think about it too much. The ocean's kind of my prayer place. It's a way for me to heal and breathe in the salt water. So I would say the resiliency component in relation to land is to be able to be home, but then also in acknowledging that previous to this kind of fixed position of reservations or allotments or whatever, we were moving people with the transitions of how our relationship to earth and place would have been. So the ability to be able to do that is a past understanding, but the current situation we're in, that component kind of needs to be addressed to continue to have formations of resiliency attached to place. But maybe you can be resilient just being with your family, being who you are, being where you are. I'm just tired of being told what to do. I don't know if that's like a thing, but man, it's yeah, that is a thing. So it would be great to my great uncle is a seer, and he used to put together maps of where flood zones would be. And he's in his 80s now, but I kind of grew up knowing that this was going to be happening. But I didn't actually understand how to transition through it. And so I find that maybe that's what led to Breach as well, is how do I help during this time that I have here on this earth in resiliency. So how do we think of resiliency as a component of futurism? That's kind of a question, maybe.
One thing that I just want to kind of add to Courtney's thoughts there is that so if we have a really diverse web of relations, if we're in relationship with lots of different beings within our homelands, then that offers a form of resiliency. So that if if you're basket makers they've got relationships with other plants and animals that give them other means to make a living, and to express themselves if brown ash is not accessible for a while. Like that's a form of resiliency, and that, there are, you can think of examples of kind of ways of making a living that are very sort of focused on a particular plant or species or activity. And that lack of diversity, if something happens, if it's a land-based activity, let's say like all is what you do is cattle ranching. If the land is no longer tenable for cattle, and you don't have another kind of relationship with a different animal or another life skill associated with that land, then that's not a very resilient situation. But if you can rely on relationships with lots of different beings within your homelands, then that's a form of resiliency that is based in relationships to the land. But as Courtney said, if we don't have access to lands, if we don't have broad access to lands, then, if like my tribe, the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, we have autonomous control over such small areas of land. It's postage stamps that, we do have treaty rights in a broader area. But, we really need autonomous control over more land area. And then we need those treaty rights to be upheld and honored. And, for our people to have space to sustain the relationships with a lot of different plant and animal relations in that broad area. And oftentimes there's obstacles being raised up in various forms and fashions to even just exert our treaty rights in that broader area. And there's certainly not a lot of doors being open for us in terms of land recovery. And so that creates a big issue, as Courtney said.
So I think we have someone raising their hand. I'm going to allow Stuart Chase to talk if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, this is Stuart Chase. I'm on the Pacific Coast right now in Monterey, California. So this conversation has been really peaceful and zen-like for me. But I do wonder, how do we continue to build relationships with all of our groups of society? How do we keep moving forward?
I would, I don't know, I think ultimately what I have appreciated is when I do kind of reach out to people that they're willing to have time and space with one another. So I think the idea of how do we come together is that beginning notion of acknowledgement, and then listening and being willing to learn. And so the practice of asking questions is something that I have learned is very valuable to kind of center ourselves, and then also develop those questions together. But it's ongoing work, and it's an ongoing relation of space that sometimes we're not afforded depending on what culture, community, society we're working in. We don't even get to take naps. Like there's no time for us to kind of be sometimes. But I find that I have to think like the idea of breach or the energy of breach, because in my deepest days of maybe not continuing to do this because I don't know how it's valued within spaces, sometimes I have to remember the people, and I have to know that that it's a blessing to be with one another. It's a blessing to share time and to learn. So I think it can happen, but we have to hold time and space with one another and the willingness to listen. And it's a practice. It's like riding your bike. You just got to get on it and do it every day. And it can't be in terms of, I was thinking that initial question or language that was brought in the beginning was the word accountability. And that's something I don't necessarily use. I kind of tend to think of responsibility, but I would say, why is it that everyone seeks out indigeneity as a resolve to these issues rather than centering ourselves through equitable means of this discussion, and that we all have to work together in this understanding kind of sense. So I wonder sometimes if we're held accountable to heal versus the rest of the world and everybody. So it's not so much labor on us, but yeah, time, space, and listening.
Well, we are out of time. I just want to thank Courtney and Suzanne and Nick for once again for being with us. Thank you all for joining us. If you are a student and you are interested in joining us, I put the link in the chat for the student meet and greet. And for those of you who ask questions about the work itself and talking about the forms, the Courtney's installation will be up at the Hood for another almost 2 years. And so we will have those conversations, and we will have Courtney visit us in person at the Hood and talk about form and materials, and work with our colleagues at the ceramic studio who have already supported this show so much, and we look forward to doing that in the future. That this is definitely not the last conversation we'll have with Courtney or about this installation. So thanks again, and we'll see you all soon. Be well.
Thank you.